So the ego becomes an almost perfectly inescapable mental matrix that is synergistically intertwined with our emotional responses. Welcome back to Journey of Self-Awareness, your YouTube channel for personal growth and self-exploration. Today we're going to talk about the power of social learning and cultural conditioning to shape our emotions and our sense of a separate self. This is important for several reasons, but mainly because as a result of social conditioning, we end up adopting a taken-for-granted view of reality that makes it almost impossible for us to see the forest for the trees. Social and cultural conditioning is the process by which we learn the beliefs, values, behaviors, and rules of conduct that are considered acceptable in our society. And like sponges, we absorb the beliefs and customs of our specific cultural group. These processes begin very early in life, and they shape pretty much everything about us. Cultural and social conditioning has a profound impact on our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. We're all shaped by the cultures and societies we grow up in. As little kids, we lack critical thinking skills, so we're pretty much wide open, and these influences are almost impossible for us to see or even recognize, at least until we're older. While growing up, we learn social definitions of what to value, what to avoid, what will bring us happiness, and what it means to be successful. And while forming a more or less coherent sense of self or self-identity, we also acquire all of our habitual emotional reactions and ways of behaving. It's crucial for us to recognize the extensive and pervasive impact conditioning has had on our worldview, our values, and our plans. First of all, this conditioning is often so powerful and taken for granted that it prevents us from seeing the world clearly and objectively. However, when we understand how our culture has shaped our values, our beliefs, and emotions, and when we take the time to critically examine them, we can begin to discover our true selves. During early childhood, we internalize social values, norms, and expectations, and as a result of social and cultural conditioning, we acquire a worldview and a perception of reality that's based upon taken for granted, underlying, and often unexamined assumptions and values. This process forms both our egoic identity and our emotions. As children, we learn what is me and what is not me, and we form an egoic sense of a separate self. Then, as we grow up, we're taught to distinguish between ourselves and the world around us. This distinction is essential for our survival, but it can also lead to the development of an egoic self that stands apart from the world. It sets us up to stand in opposition to the world, or as the song says, it's just you and me against the world. Thus, the ego, or the sense of a separate self as I, me, mine, emerges as a product of cultural conditioning and social influences, and we unwittingly become enmeshed in a socially constructed ego with its own foibles, personality traits, and values that may be as imperceptible to us as water is to a fish. So the ego becomes an almost perfectly inescapable mental matrix that is synergistically intertwined with our emotional responses. That is, our emotions act as a filter through which we perceive and interpret our experiences while supporting, validating, and strengthening the egoic self. The ego clings to familiar emotional reactions, seeking to protect itself from discomfort and vulnerability. And this clinging further fuels our negative emotional responses and prevents us from experiencing and understanding our true self. So both the ego and our negative emotions work together to preserve the sense of a separate self, which completely obstructs our personal growth and keeps us from finding true peace and lasting fulfillment. We also learn the social roles we're supposed to play, and those roles often become integral parts of the egoic self. The self becomes attached to certain roles as sources of identification, validation, approval, and prestige. We end up saying, I am a son, or I am a student, or we might say, I am a Republican, so that particular roles become part of our self-identity. Of course, these roles also include our gender. Social learning is so powerful that sociologists frequently talk about the social construction of reality. You see, children perceive the world as intensely real and develop taken-for-granted interpretations of reality. Young children are highly influenced by their social surroundings, including their family, caregivers, and the wider culture. We absorb the beliefs, norms, and expectations of our society, internalizing them as our own without questioning them. During early childhood, we rely on adults and authorities as sources of knowledge, often accepting the information we receive without question. The taken-for-granted assumptions and values that we learn become the lenses through which we perceive reality. The problem is that, later in life, these lenses often obscure our true nature and our authentic values. Of course, society also molds our perceptions of what's important and what we should value. Family, education, media, and other social institutions transmit cultural values that we acquire during socialization. That is, as we grow up, we internalize and adopt the values, beliefs, and norms that are prevalent in our society, and those values greatly influence ego development so that we can often become attached to those values. For example, Euro-American cultures tend to emphasize fame, beauty, power, social status, and material wealth. We're bombarded with messages that equate success with external markers of happiness and fulfillment. From a young age, we absorb these beliefs, internalizing them as the true sources of happiness and satisfaction. We can be caught up in a rat race of pursuing external validation or driven by an insatiable desire for more and more, believing that possessions or wealth or social approval will finally bring us lasting happiness. But we eventually discover that external sources of happiness are ultimately unsatisfying. During childhood, we not only acquire our values, wants, and desires, but social conditioning also largely forms our emotions and our habitual emotional reactions. For instance, we unconsciously absorb emotional responses from our caregivers, peers, and social influences. These learned emotional reactions become deeply ingrained in us, and they also include all of the harmful emotions we acquire. We need to pay particular attention to the harmful and destructive emotions, or what the Tibetans call the negative emotional obscurations to awareness. Emotional obscurations refer to the tangled web of negative emotions, unresolved traumas, and conditioned reactions that cloud our perception and prevent us from experiencing the true nature of the self. These emotions include anger, fear, jealousy, and attachment. They keep us bound to the confines of the egoic self, and deeper down, emotional obscurations also include far more subtle layers of dissatisfaction, a general feeling of lack or emptiness, or subtle desires and irritations. The important point here is that emotional obscurations keep us from finding genuine peace and fulfillment. In fact, Tibetan Buddhists think of emotional obscurations as mental disturbances and afflictions that unbalance the mind. They perpetuate suffering, and they completely block the path to enlightenment. The 5 main emotional obscurations are known as the 5 poisons. The first is attachment or desire and craving, which is the strong clinging to such things as material possessions. It causes dissatisfaction and perpetuates a cycle of pleasure-seeking that prevents true inner contentment. The second is aversion, which encompasses feelings of anger, hatred, or hostility toward others or even oneself. It creates inner turmoil and disrupts mental clarity, and aversion also hinders the development of compassion and empathy. The third poison is ignorance or delusion, which refers to a lack of understanding of the true nature of the self and of reality. It fosters misconceptions, misunderstandings, and a distorted view of the world, which obstructs wisdom and insight. The fourth is pride in oneself, which often stems from an inflated sense of self-importance or feelings of superiority. Self-pride reinforces the ego's illusion of separateness, and it keeps us from developing humility. The fifth poison is jealousy, which involves feelings of envy and resentment toward other successes or possessions. It breeds negativity and comparison, undermining our own contentment while preventing the cultivation of empathetic joy or feelings of genuine happiness for others. In future videos, we'll delve into each of these mental poisons. Tibetans say that recognizing, acknowledging, and ultimately overcoming negative obscurations requires mindfulness and meditation, but it's also essential for us to cultivate and practice positive virtues such as compassion and loving kindness. By working to overcome our mental afflictions, we can gradually purify the mind, develop greater self-awareness, and acquire wisdom, all of which are essential if we want to realize our true nature and achieve lasting happiness. When we understand how both our negative emotional reactions and our ego were formed during childhood, we realize that we're socially constructed beings. None of this is immutable. Our egoic identities, our emotional patterns, and our very sense of self, they're not inherent or fixed or predetermined. Because they're the result of social learning, it means that we can also unlearn them. We may have been defenseless as children, but as adults, we have the ability to challenge the messages we've received from others and the larger culture. This means we have the power to break free and form a sense of self that's truly authentic and fulfilling. In fact, we may not realize it, but as we interact with others in our social surroundings, our sense of self is always constantly evolving anyway, which is really good news because it means that we have the potential for growth and we can actively change ourselves for the better. However, knowing that we can be influenced by outside forces also means that we need to be critical of the messages we receive. This adds a layer of responsibility because instead of being passive recipients of social influences, we have to take charge of our own paths. We need to develop a genuine and authentic sense of self that's based on our own experiences, our own knowledge, and our own values. This is yet another reason why self-reflection is so critical. Before we can really make much progress on a path toward true liberation and happiness, we must develop greater self-awareness, and we have to be willing to challenge the results of our cultural conditioning. To free ourselves from the confines of the ego and see the world as it really is, we must understand the social influences that have shaped our lives. We must recognize the sources of our negative emotions so we can begin to untangle ourselves from them. By loosening the ego's grip and exploring our emotions with openness, we can begin to liberate ourselves from the web of conditioning and nurture a more genuine sense of happiness and fulfillment. I hope that the information I've shared in this video will help you see that the sense of a separate self is an illusion, and that our negative emotional patterns prevent us from connecting with our true self. I urge you to please explore these topics further by reading from various spiritual traditions and working to develop greater self-awareness through a daily practice. If you do, I'm confident you will be able to connect with your true nature, which is love, peace, and joy. Well, that's all for today. Please be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next video, all about escaping the hamster wheel of desires. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time, and until then, remember to relax and pay attention.